Hi, welcome back. This is part two of our three-part series on our immigration story. Anjini did a good job of going into very fine detail on our application process.
If you haven't yet watched part one of our video, we'll link it down below so that you get an idea of the history of this journey.
So life after being issued a COPR, this is when it gets real. Like you don't really have much time to celebrate because there's a timeline where you need to move to Canada. So in this video, we're going to discuss our preparation to move, all the details. We're going to discuss how we moved our funds from Trinidad to Canada, how we moved our belongings, how we resigned from our jobs, and was there a deadline? Could we move whenever we wanted? Could we move in 1 month? Did we have 1 year to move? Did we have 5 years? All this and more coming up next.
So let's just recap. So Suren and I received our COPR on January 15th, 2020. And basically, this was an email that we got stating that we got the approval, and it had some instructions stating for us to submit our passport to our local embassy, where we were issued with a temporary visa. This temporary visa is what allows you to enter Canada. So it took us roughly 2 weeks to get our passports back with this visa. And upon reviewing the visa, we were basically advised that we had a deadline in order to enter Canada. And this deadline was based on the date in which we would have completed our medical, which would have been from the year prior. So since we did our medical the first week in September 2019, we had a deadline to enter Canada by September 2020. So the first thing that we started to do after we got the temporary visa, we decided on a tentative date that we wanted to leave Trinidad. Since we were issued our COPR on January 15, 2020, we decided that because we had a deadline date of September 2020 to leave Trinidad, that the best time for us to move to Canada was the beginning of summer. So that would have been mid-June 2020.
So this is a very important decision when deciding the time to move to Canada. Us being from a tropic country, we want to move to Canada when it's warm, right? During summer. We don't want to come to Canada or migrate to Canada in the colder times. It might be very tough on our bodies, again, moving around, getting accustomed, getting clothes. So you want to come to Canada when it's best suited, which is during the summertime. Okay, so after deciding on a tentative date for our move, we decided to meet with our financial institutes. Well, we made appointments, we went in and we met with them. Now, there were different options, and here I'm going to list them, all the options that were available to us. So we weighed our options, and as anyone would do, we went into our financial institutes. We discussed it with them, and we weighed the exchange rate. The exchange rate back then was probably 5.3, 5.4, which the bank was giving to us. So that was the first option, but unfortunately, these banks, the currency is very scarce, and they were only prioritizing them to businesses. So your name will had to go on a list. So for instance, what we did is like we gave them a sum, like I needed, let's say for instance, a couple thousand Canadian, and I told them, okay, this is what I wanted, and I had the source, I had the funds in my bank account, and they would say, okay, no problem, it's very scarce right now. We'll put your name on a list, and when it's available, we'll issue it to you. This process, like any other process, takes a very long time. Again, it is what it is, and every couple weeks, I would say every 3 to 4 weeks, they will call me in and call Anjini in, and we will get a couple $100. We started piling it up, and this was option number one, putting your name on a foreign exchange list in a financial institute and hoping for the best. The next option was wire transfers. Now, wire transfers is very similar to requesting foreign exchange from any major financial institute. To execute the wire transfer, we needed a bank account in Canada to transfer the funds into. So seeking advice from my relatives, they actually opened a bank account in their name and allowed me to transfer funds from Trinidad into Canada. Now we had a Canadian bank account to transfer our funds into. This was just painstaking as putting your name on a foreign exchange list in the financial institute. I put in a request to transfer a couple $1,000s into this bank account, and the wire transfer, again, it took the same amount of time. Every couple of weeks they would call us in, and we transferred a couple thousand Canadian into this bank account. Now the next option that we looked into was looking for foreign exchange amongst our peers, looking for foreign exchange amongst our family and friends. We simply asked around who had foreign exchange and we would buy it from them. Now, what was available was Canadian, US. Now, not a lot of people had foreign exchange at that point in time, but we did what we did and we piled our funds together. Now, slowly it started coming in. Weirdly enough, we had a lot of friends who traveled a lot and who had some foreign exchange lying around, and we simply bought it from them. Now, another option that by research, I found was that one of the major banks in Trinidad actually offers you to take the same debit card and withdraw $100 per day in any ATM in the entire world internationally. So now this was kind of like top secret because only when you went into the bank and opened a bank account, and then I realized that this was an option. Now, if you want to know more about this, you can reach out to me. I don't want to use specifics and name financial institutes, but this was a major option that you were able to withdraw $100 in any international bank in the world from this debit card, not a credit card, a debit card. Another option was our credit cards. Each credit card in all of the major financial institutes in Trinidad, they offer cash advance. Cash advance means that you could actually go into the ATM anywhere in the entire world, any ABM, and withdraw that country's foreign exchange. So for instance, you could take your credit card and you could go to the US and you could withdraw US currency. You could take that credit card, you could go to the UK and withdraw euros. So that was another option. In Trinidad, this is also limited to your billing cycle. So for instance, let's use an example of 1,000 US for your billing cycle of, let's say, a month. Within that month or within that billing cycle, you're allowed to withdraw 1,000 US dollars within your billing cycle. Now, there's also another limit of withdrawing a certain amount daily. Discuss it with your financial institutes, and because it's based and it varies from credit card to credit card. So what I did is like what we did, like anyone person would do with this option. I went to the major financial institutes. I opened bank accounts. We opened bank accounts each, and we applied for credit cards. At the end of this, exploring this option, I had a thick stack of credit cards. So I was able to withdraw funds in Canada from the cash advance option from each credit card. Now, with this cash advance option, there's also a cash advance fee. Now, as opposed to the previous discussed topic with the withdrawing from the debit card, there are no fees. So the debit card option for right now, it seems like the best option because you don't have any fees attached to them. But again, we weighed as much options as we could. We tried to move as much funds as we could, and the cash advance option is a little more pricey. But again, is what options are available to you and how efficient are you to move these funds out of Trinidad into Canada. Now, another option that we explored was a manager's check or a bank draft. Most financial institutes issue this bank draft, but it's very important that you specify the currency. Now, I know of immigrants who have moved to Canada and they got a bank draft, but unfortunately the bank draft was in TT dollars, and when they came to Canada or any other country, they weren't able to cash in this bank draft. So it's always good to specify what currency this bank draft is in. And I'm sure that if you're going to go with this option, you're going to go through the same process. They're going to tell you if you want a couple thousand Canadian, you're going to have to be on a list, and it's only when foreign exchange is available, you're going to be issued foreign exchange. It may be in parts, it may be, if you're lucky enough, you may get a lump sum. But these are the options that were available to us, and these are the options that we actually use to move our currency from Trinidad to Canada.
So during the time that we were meeting with our various banks and started doing the wire transfers and accumulating cash, we were also trying to figure out the best time to resign from our jobs. Now, from the time Suren and I submitted this application in September 2019, based on the estimated processing time, which was around 6 months, Suren and I had already started to formulate when would have been the best time for us to resign in 2020. So we actually planned our resignation from since the year prior. And what we decided on, based on the processing time of the 6 months, we were estimating that we would have gotten our COPR sometime in March. So we had both agreed from since the year prior that we wanted to leave our jobs by the end of April 2020. So we were in the middle of drafting our resignation letters to keep with that timeline. Now, for me, I actually had to give more than 1 month's notice to my employer. So I actually ended up giving 2 months notice. So versus Suren, who only had to give about a month or even just under a month's notice. So we decided that because I had to give about 2 months notice, that I would send in my resignation first. And again, this was planned strategically from the year before. We worked it out in such a way that financially we would have been okay to leave our jobs by the end of April, because even with the intended date for us to leave in June, we knew that we wanted to take the months of May to June off to work on other things that we had to work on, making final arrangements to leave Trinidad, and also because we wanted to take some time to spend with our families, and we felt like April was the best time for us to leave. So I officially submitted my resignation to my employer the first week in March, with the intended last week of my employment to be the end of April, based on our original schedule that we had planned from the year prior. So timing is everything. So what happened after I submitted my resignation that first week in March? Well, as time would have it, exact 7 days after I submitted my resignation, what happened? COVID happened. Yes, exact 7 days. We officially found out on the news that COVID had finally hit Trinidad, and officially everything was at a standstill, and the government was talking about shutting down the borders.
You remember what happened or where we received the news?
I remember Suren and I first found out this news about COVID and the borders being shut down. We were actually at one of our bank appointments. We were coordinating one of our several financial transactions when we saw the news conference come on, saying that COVID had finally arrived to Trinidad.
Well, this was at the end of March 2020. And at this point in time, we were moving funds from Trinidad to Canada. At this point in time, everything was at a standstill. Borders closed, banking institutions non-existent, activity lining up outside. Everything's closed, malls closed, everything just turned upside down. Just to recap or give you a status update on our financial movements. At this point in time, we probably moved 20% or exchanged 20% of our funds into Canadian. So it was really, honestly, it was really crazy. Like, everything came at a standstill, and we had a meeting, and we was like, I don't know what's going to happen now. Most importantly, how are we going to move? The airports are closed. How are we going to get a flight out of Trinidad? The deadline is coming up, and honestly, I believe that something would have happened and something would have pulled through.
So after the news conference, we were basically, thinking about what were our next steps. Now, the reality is, and the truth is, nobody knew what COVID was at this point in time. It wasn't something that you heard about. No one really took it seriously. Everyone just thought it was a virus and that everyone would get over it. There wasn't really much information or knowledge about this virus at the time. So Suren and I were still very heavily invested in this move. So even though things seemed more at a standstill, we were still very much still interested to stick to our original plan. We still had intended to push to see if we could have left Trinidad to reach Canada in June. We were still very much hopeful that, the airports would have resumed, because again, no one really knew what COVID was. And even though based on the announcement, we were still pushing to ensure that we got the wire transfers done, we were still collecting, cash. And I also still was very firm on wanting to leave my job the time when I wanted to leave it, because we were still aiming to leave in June.
So as time progressed, let's fast forward to April, May. So then the financial institutes were closed, and we had to come up with a plan to get our funds out. So that's where we really pushed, and we pushed to use the same options that I just discussed. The financial institutions at this point in time were only issuing foreign exchange, again, for educational services. Like, for instance, the students wanted to go abroad to study, and medical services. Again, it's COVID, so any kind of medical surgeries you had to get done, any kind of medical support, uh patients going out to different opcos of hospitals. That's all the financial institutions were doing. They were issuing foreign exchange to medical and educational services. So immigration wasn't really on top of their priority, but we were still able to get some foreign exchange from the banks or the financial institutes during this time. And again, it was really tough, but we were able to still get some. But the other options really came into play. Taking foreign exchange from your credit cards, our friends, our families, they really pulled through. So originally, I wanted to submit my resignation at the end of March and stick with the same timeline of both of us resigning at the end of April. So we discussed it, and we decided to hold off on it based on the situation that the economy was in.
So, with the COVID cases continuing to rise dramatically over the space of what seemed like under 4 weeks, and with my last day of work fast approaching, I decided that I still wanted to leave my job at the end of April. Now, I understand that this was a decision that, not everyone could have made during this time. I know there were a lot of uncertainties. I still felt pretty confident about sticking to this original plan because this was something that both of us had planned for since the year before. And I had planned it in such a way that I would have still been financially, okay for a couple of months, as we still originally, wanted to leave in June, not thinking that, things would have gotten worse because, again, we just didn't know what was going to happen. There wasn't a lot of information and we were still very much hopeful. So I made a decision still to leave at the end of April because I knew that during this point in time, there was a lot more work that needed to be done. It wasn't just about, speaking with the banks and waiting on finances. We had a lot more things that we knew we had to do before actually leaving Trinidad. A lot of preparations for our actual move and settling into Canada that required a lot of my time. So I made that decision with the intention of taking, the month of May and June off so I could, assist, Suren out. I remember that when I made the decision to leave my job at the end of April in the midst of COVID, I knew that everyone thought I was crazy. And I knew that there were a lot of doubters and people asked me, are you sure you want to leave your job? Do you think it's the best time? But the reality is I was very much focused on where my life was heading versus where it was right at that point in time, even amidst uncertainty. We were both heavily invested in ensuring that we left when we needed to leave because I was focused on ensuring that we did everything that we could to ensure we left before our deadline of September. So while not everyone agreed with my decision, and maybe no one would have really understood why, at the end of the day, I still very much believed that we would have made it through in the midst of this crazy time. So I was able to finally leave my job at the end of April, and then Suren and I spent the month of May starting to look at other steps that we needed to take to make this move happen amidst waiting for the banks to give us the wire transfers. So some of the things that we started to do, we started to basically find out if there were any flights. And I know that you're probably wondering, how could there be any flights? Because weren't the borders closed? The borders were closed to the public, but the airport was not really closed. So there were no commercial flights coming into the airport. However, there were chartered flights coming in because at the end of the day, persons who were stuck in Trinidad needed to get back to their home country. There were students who needed to get back to university. So there were still flights. So what we did basically, we literally called Piaco International Airport almost every day because we heard from a friend of a friend of a friend that there were flights coming in. And basically, it was a first come to basically get your name on a list to be added to potential incoming chartered flights. So that's one of the things that we did. And then I started to do some research on my own on Facebook. I discovered a group on Facebook called Trinis Who Need to Depart TNT. So this was a Facebook group created for persons who were basically either non-nationals of Trinidad who needed to get back to their home countries, or as well for persons, who also new immigrants and who were looking to leave Trinidad at that point in time. So I subscribed to this group, and literally every day I was on Facebook several times a day looking at the updates on this group, because there were persons on this group who had information about incoming chartered flights.
Now, this group is still active. If any of you are interested in searching it up, it is on Facebook. I will share a link below.
Now, because there were no commercial airlines allowed to come into the country, the flights that were coming in, the costs were extremely expensive. And more so, there was a very small window of time that you had to basically put your name on a list, and you were literally just waiting for a call or a message to find out if you were able to get a seat on the particular flight. And even more so, because during this time there were no flights that were taking full capacity. It was very limited availability on these flights. So literally a private charter flight would come in, and it would literally have space for probably only at the time maybe 10 to 20 persons. So it was a lot of just waiting, trying to figure out, if there was a flight. And during at this point in time, we realized that we were not going to originally make our original scheduled date to arrive, which was in June, which we understood. There was nothing that we could have done, but we were still hoping, and praying at this point in time that something would have been available to us to still be able to make it to Canada before September.
So during this time, we were planning to move to Canada. We were trying to stick with our original date. But where were we moving to? We unanimously decided on moving to Mississauga. Anjini has family here. We visited here before. It's a very clean, comfortable area. It's also very close to Toronto. The transit time is about 20-30 minutes max. We chose here because it's a very, the transit system in Mississauga is very good. It's close to all the neighboring areas. There's a lot of jobs in Mississauga. It's very clean. We've really felt comfortable about moving to Mississauga. On moving to Canada, we needed to decide on housing. So we chose Mississauga, and we got in touch with Deane. We'll link his information below. He's a real estate agent operating in the GTA. He really went the extra mile to help us get housing. We reached out to him. We had phone calls, we had video calls, seeking our options, what are our options in getting housing, renting in Mississauga. He gave us some websites to look at. We'll link them below, and you could go through them, see what housing suits you best. And from that, we start sending him, like, for instance, we send him like our budget. We need to have a budget of what housing we could afford, and we took it from there. But he really suggests that when we actually land in Canada, he'll take us around.
So in speaking with Brian, one of the best advice that he gave us was that we actually could not coordinate any housing from Trinidad. We actually were advised that we had to actually land in Canada in order to actually coordinate getting housing. So that was something that at the time we thought we could have done from Trinidad, but that isn't the case. You actually need to wait till you land, because as you'll realize when you come to Canada, housing, it's very scarce, and you might look at a house or even a rental today, and by the end of the day it's gone. And that's what we slowly realized. So we were on the websites that he recommended to us, and we found a couple of rental properties that we were interested in, and literally within 24 hours it was already taken. So he basically advised us it's not worthwhile trying to finalize housing as yet, and he advised us to wait. But he gave us great advice in terms of how to prepare, in terms of how much rent was required. So in discussing with him and in also doing our research, we found out as a new immigrant coming to Canada, there's something called credit history. And coming from Trinidad, you're coming with zero credit history. And credit history is what matters the most in Canada or for any other first world country that you go to. If you don't have credit history, there's no way that a lender or a landlord is going to even consider taking you on. So we were advised to save up a minimum of 6 months rent to be able to put up front upon landing. So those were some of the preparations that we started to do. We wanted to ensure that the wire transfers, that we allocated that immediately towards our rent, because we knew more than likely this was going to happen.
The only appliances that rental properties actually do come with are fridge, washer, dryer, stove, and dishwasher. All the appliances we had to put aside X amount of money to cater for. Now this was money that we had to set aside and we catered for from planning extensively in Trinidad.
So during this lockdown period, Suren and I created a spreadsheet. And what we started to do, so we started just to research some household items, furniture, kitchen appliances. So we actually built a spreadsheet and we wanted to get an estimate of the actual cost. And this helped us greatly because this is how you would actually know the cost of items in Canada. So we actually budgeted a certain amount to go towards what would have been the smaller appliances that we knew we would have had to purchase, as well as our furniture that we would have had to purchase. So some of the websites that we looked at were, we looked at IKEA, Walmart, Canadian Tire, Home Depot. Those are the major websites that we use to get an estimate of the average price of basic household items, and we budgeted that accordingly. So during this lockdown period, while we were exploring housing options, we were still waiting for months and months for wire transfers. We were brainstorming household items and appliances that we had to purchase. At this point in time, it was the end of July, and I had been notified on the Facebook group Trinis Who Want to Depart TNT that there was an upcoming flight available for the first week in August. So I put our names on the list with the intention for us to actually leave. And during this time when we thought that, we were finally going to leave on this flight, we started to make preparations to sell our vehicles. So we started to advertise selling our vehicles online. And luckily, Suren was able to sell his vehicle. My car was not successful to be sold right away, so I had a further delay in getting my car sold. And one of the other things that we were also doing leading up to this flight in early August, we started to have discussions about what we wanted to take with us to Canada in terms of how many pieces of luggage did we want to take. So we both decided that we would leave with 2 pieces of luggage as well as hand luggage, but we also had other items that we wanted to take with us, so much larger, bulkier items. So what we decided to do, we just took the essentials that we needed in our luggage. We decided to pack all of our essential documents, and then the non-essential items we decided to actually ship in barrels. So all of the heavier, bulky items, clothes that, weren't everyday use, we decided to pack that in barrels. So we made a couple of calls to find out at the time, the best price that we could have gotten to ship our other much larger items in barrels, and trying to find out the costs and the timelines, because we knew that everything was pretty much delayed. So we were anticipating that even if we had shipped barrels right away, it would have taken considerable amount of time to reach Canada. So those are some of the preparations that we were making. And then finally, during this point in time, so upon landing to Canada, at this point in time, the government of Canada had mandated a 14-day quarantine for all passengers that were arriving to Canada. So at this point in time, we had to do some research on, where we wanted to quarantine because the government had very strict stipulations. At this point in time, there was no such thing as sharing rooms with anyone. It was very limited in terms of transportation that you were allowed to take exiting the airport. So we were exploring our options there as well. We had a very short window of time to actually get all of these activities done in time for the first week of August. Literally 2 days before we were supposed to fly out, we were informed that the flight was cancelled last minute. So we were basically back to square one, just waiting and waiting again, for notifications of when we would have gotten a flight. So after our original flight got cancelled, I was notified from the Facebook group that there was another upcoming flight and it was scheduled to leave Trinidad on August 17th, 2020. Now, we found out about this flight literally 2 or 3 days before this flight. So we literally had a very limited window of time to make sure we had everything in order. Now, luckily, because we were already packed, intending to leave on the original flight, we didn't really have a lot of additional items that we needed to pack, and we had already started to coordinate shipping our barrels. So after confirming the details of the flight, we found out that it was in fact not a direct flight from Trinidad to Canada, because at this point in time there were no direct flights to any country in the world. So the airlines that we ended up boarding on was a Norwegian airline, and we basically found out that we had to board this airline to leave Trinidad, and then we would have had to go to Barbados, where there would have been a 10-hour layover, and then from Barbados we then had to take a Caribbean Airlines flight to get to Jamaica, where we had to overnight, and then we had to take an Air Canada flight the next morning that would directly take us to Toronto. So we found out that this was going to take a process of 36 hours. Now, in preparing for this flight, there were certain protocols in place that we had to follow when traveling to the various countries. So one of the mandates at the point in time to enter Barbados, we had to do a PCR test in order to gain entry to Barbados. Now, at this point in time, a PCR test was the only type of test that was available to detect the presence of COVID. Now, there were very limited institutes at the point in time in Trinidad that were issuing PCR tests for travel purposes, because at the point in time, doing a PCR test at that time in COVID in Trinidad, it would take you several days, if not a week, to get your results. But for travel purposes, there were 2 institutes in Trinidad that were issuing PCR tests for travel purposes that would give you your results within 24 hours. So upon reviewing the Barbados website in terms of their protocols, we found out that Barbados at the time had 3 different levels of alerts in terms of COVID. And they were basically classifying their cases in different bubbles, so to speak. So based on the amount of COVID cases, they were mandating when PCR tests had to be issued to be accepted. They mandated that PCR tests had to be done 72 hours prior to arrival in Barbados. Now, at this point in time, Barbados was on the verge of actually changing their restrictions. I remember having to call the Barbados airport 2 days before to find out if they were actually going to change their restrictions, because if they changed their restrictions, they were actually going to mandate that the PCR test had to be done 24 hours. So when I called the Barbados airport, so this would have been very early Saturday morning, they advised me that no, I can still go ahead and take my PCR tests within the 72 hours. So basically any passengers that were going to arrive from that Monday into the country, even if their laws had changed, they were still going to take it as approved PCR tests. Now, because during that point of time, I remember that weekend, it was very chaotic, because I remember at that point in time, the cases in Trinidad had drastically spiked. There was a major increase that weekend. and it meant even more restrictions, and we were very fearful that perhaps the flight may have been cancelled, but we were guaranteed that it was a go. And I basically made a decision because I didn't want to take the chance that something had happened between the space of 24 hours in doing this PCR test that they wouldn't have accepted the results based on what was going on in both Trinidad and Barbados. So I decided to ensure that we got our PCR test done 48 hours prior to arrival. So in the event something did change, it would have still been valid. The reason why I decided to do that route because we had to take a second flight to get to Jamaica. And based on researching what were the requirements for Jamaica, they also had to see proof of a negative PCR test. And I felt like doing the PCR test 48 hours prior to arrival, it would have given us a better chance that there would have been no issues or delays in the airport. So that was one of the initiatives that we did. So the two institutions at the time that were administering these PCR tests for travel purposes was St. Augustine Medical, and then there was a private medical clinic in Port of Spain. The cost to do the test, so it was basically $1,200 TT dollars at the medical clinic versus $950 at St. Augustine Medical. Because we were in Port of Spain, we decided to go with the private medical clinic, even though it was more expensive. So we both went in Saturday morning to do our PCR test, and we had never done a PCR test before. And luckily, we got our results 24 hours the next day via email confirming that we were both negative. So literally, we could not get on the flight on Monday if we did not have this PCR test. So what were the costs for the flights involved? So as I mentioned, it turned out to be 3 different flights that we had to take, starting with the Norwegian Airlines taking us to Barbados, then taking Caribbean Airlines to Jamaica, and then taking an Air Canada flight to Toronto. Because it was a private chartered flight, that was pretty expensive, and in general at that point in time, because there was literally no travel, the costs for the other flights were significantly expensive. So the cost for both of us for the flights was within the range of 10 to 20,000 TT dollars. I know this is ridiculous and it was ridiculously expensive, but we were approaching a deadline where we knew we had to leave and we didn't have a choice but to pay that price.
All right, so these restrictions that to enter each country that Anjini mentioned, we had to research out ourselves. So in the group, they actually gave us this information and gave us guidelines, but we actually went onto each government's website individually and researched the requirements to enter the country. Now, Barbados, at the point in time, they wanted a negative PCR test on entry, but Jamaica wanted you to be vaccinated for yellow fever. So each country was different, and obviously we need to do our research to get these things done.
So even though to enter Barbados and Jamaica, they needed to see proof of a negative PCR test, when we were doing our research for the requirements to enter Canada, it was not yet mandatory to show proof of a negative PCR test. However, it was mandatory that we had to create a quarantine plan to show upon entry into Canada. So basically, on the Canada website, the government provided some guidelines in terms of what this document had to have. So basically, we needed to draft a document to indicate what were our quarantine plans, how are we going to be able to get food and groceries without interacting with other persons, how are we going to coordinate our transportation from the airport to our place of quarantine. And this was something that we had to provide to the immigration and customs when we arrived in Canada. We decided that for our 14-day quarantine, that we were going to spend in an Airbnb, and we ended up booking an Airbnb in downtown Toronto, and we had to include the address and the details of this place of quarantine in our quarantine plan to show to our immigration officer. It was our plan at the end of the 14-day quarantine in downtown Toronto that we would have moved to a local hotel in Mississauga where we would have started our search for houses.
So let's talk about our actual trip. The flight out of Trinidad was at 5:30 a.m. in the morning, very early. Now the airports were closed, but only immediate relatives were allowed to accompany us into the airport. So it wasn't like all friends and family, our entire family was allowed in the airport. Now at the airport, there weren't a lot of people. I think this was probably the only time I saw the airport empty. The entire car park was empty. All the stations in the airport was empty. It was only literally it was only us in the airport. And the flight leaving Trinidad was probably about 30 persons in the flight, and it was all social distance. As Anjini mentioned, it was a Norwegian flight and the plane was huge. It was a very, very spacious plane. Because we were married, we were allowed to sit together, but everyone else social distance. So we arrived in Barbados 7 a.m. It was a very easy flight, no major issues. When we landed, however, the immigration of Barbados did not expect the flight to come in. The immigration office were not there as yet, so we had to wait a couple hours for them to receive us. With the minor inconvenience, and within an hour or two we were able to enter the airport, and they were able to validate our PCR test. Again, this is the requirement to enter Barbados at the point in time. So after 3 to 4 hours waiting on our luggage, we got transported from the terminal to the front of the airport where the general public was. We weren't allowed to leave, and there was a layover of 10 hours until our flight to Jamaica at 5:30. Now, in the front of the airport, there's not much accommodation for seating. We actually literally slept on benches waiting for our flight to Jamaica. It was a bit uncomfortable at the point in time. We got to experience the local culture a bit because the only food place that was open around that time was Shepherd. So we were able to get something to eat. We know we had a long journey ahead of us. Arriving in Jamaica, there was a very long processing time in the airport. Again, the lines were very long. We probably waited 3 to 4 hours trying to be processed by immigration and the nursing staff, trying to validate our PCR tests, our yellow fever shots and stuff. But after that was over, we collected our luggage and we were off to our hotel. We booked it online. Again, we catered for all of this. We took a bus from the airport to the hotel, and on arriving at the hotel, we were met by security at the gate. He told us that the hotel was closed for the night, and I was like, what? I booked this online. He was like, no, the entire hotel is closed. So the security guy was a really nice guy. He actually called the sister hotel, and it was actually available to book us for the night. And so the same bus guy, he transferred us to the sister hotel, and we were able to spend the night. Now, when entering the hotel, now this is very late in the night, probably 9:30, 10 o'clock. We were getting tired from our trip. We were very hungry. However, there was a cafe in the hotel that we got a quick snack, and it was off to bed. Now the next morning in Jamaica, the protocol for Jamaica is that you're allowed to quarantine in a hotel. So we went downstairs to have breakfast in the cafe, which was included in our accommodation. But the breakfast staff told us that we cannot leave the hotel room, and we had to order room service. This was shocking to us because we didn't know this from before, and but it was fine. Again, all safety protocols need to be administered when you're entering different countries, and we respected that. After having a quick breakfast in the room, our flight was at 10:30, leaving Jamaica by Air Canada to go towards our final destination of Canada. Now, from our flight from Trinidad to Barbados was socially distanced, very spacious. Our flight from Barbados to Jamaica was socially distanced. But however, the flight from Jamaica to Canada was not socially distanced. The airport was open to the public, and it was ram packed. Like, there was a lot of people in Jamaica's airport traveling during peak COVID. We double mask. We switched our masks regularly. The flight leaving Jamaica, again, it was a smooth flight. The flight itself was smooth. You got meals and stuff on the plane. But just it being crowded in peak COVID, it was kind of worrisome to us. We were very skeptical about touching surfaces and everyone around us. And again, as regular people will be aware, is that on aircrafts, everyone is very, again, tightly crammed, and people were coughing, people were sneezing, and it was, I wouldn't say uncomfortable, but it was just alarming to us to know that the aircraft was, again, packed.
So, upon landing in Toronto, we were asked to present our visa that we were granted. We were asked to show them our COPR, and the officer directed us to a different line for new landing immigrants. So upon entering this new line, our documents were processed by the immigration officer. So we were asked to submit again the COPR, our visa. We were also asked to submit our quarantine plan. Some routine questions were asked us to confirm our temporary place of quarantine and a contact number. And that entire process took just about 5 minutes. And at the end of those 5 minutes, the immigration officer looked at both of us and said, "Congratulations, you are now permanent residents." And I remember for both of us, I think we were both speechless at this point in time. I think we were both overcome with emotion. We were so incredibly exhausted from the past 36 hours. And I remember we just didn't know what to say. And I think we were both having flashbacks of everything that we had been through from since December 2018, thinking about all the obstacles we faced going through COVID to leave Trinidad. And in what we would have thought would have been, the most hectic or most difficult part of the journey, it basically was confirmed in a matter of 5 minutes, and that's all it took. And basically we were given some instructions in terms of the length of time it would take for our permanent residence cards to be delivered to us. So you actually don't get your what they call PR cards upon arriving in your airport. You still need to use your COPR document as proof, and it takes a couple of weeks or so for your actual PR cards to be delivered to your address.
So that brings us to the end of part 2. In part 3, our last part of this series, discussing our immigration story, we're going to discuss settling in Canada and all the struggles, all the triumphs, all the pros, the cons, the mistakes we made, what we recommend when you actually land in Canada, and how to settle, how to get things, again, going fast. Please like, subscribe, comment. It really supports the channel, and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you.